We thought we'd try and test out some of the ideas that we've been working with over the past few days by taking you through a discussion on this building and the project we tried to constitute in this space. Of course, it goes without saying there are many people involved in this project. Again, Moritz van Beverdonk directs the center at the moment, Heidi Grunebaum, who is on leave, Luando, Lendelwa, and a range of other people, who Sam, Riza. Then there are too many people to mention by name, but they're all involved in constituting this project. So just to think about this collectively, even though Kim and I will try and take you through different articulations of the work that we're trying to do here. And rather than talk about the actual projects, we'll ask Sipokazi maybe to describe some of the new work they're doing and some of the herds. You've seen some of the video. I want to draw out some of the conceptual terrain that we're working with in this building. And I think it comes from this idea that, you know, this is more than a building. We'll joke in the old days when we were on the main campus that we're not engaged, you know, that this isn't an edifice complex. That what we're trying to think here is to wrap ideas of the CHR around, you know, what we're trying to achieve at UWC. And I think I want to lay out where some of that inspiration comes from, where some of that thinking comes from, so that we can try and plot whether this question that we've articulated over the past few days on culture and techniques might fit into a set of re-articulations. Just to say at the very outset, the center was formed around a very basic question. And it asked whether we could elaborate a concept of the post-apartheid where no such object was available. And so, as easy as that question kind of rolled off the tongue, we soon discovered that there was lots more complexity in the way one approached that question. And so, for the first few years of the center's life, with many fellows that passed through here, at one point between 2017 to the present, we had about 300 fellows, doctoral, postdoctoral, masters, honors, most of them who are now placed at universities in South Africa, but also abroad, tried to think through this question as more than a question of South Africa. So refusing the kind of geopolitics of apartheid as a South African question, but thinking about the post-apartheid as a desire worth elaborating into concept in some form or the other. And so in many ways, the project was to ask whether we could think our way out of the predicament of apartheid. And that was the big ask, if you like. Partly because in the period immediately after 94, we found ourselves at a university that was marked by the inheritance of apartheid in every respect. It was more than that designation, historically black university, which very quickly in development discourses became historically disadvantaged institutions, and any number of terms related to underdevelopment. We found ourselves in a place of asking this question about what it might mean to think our way out of the predicament of apartheid, out of its inheritance. And that proved even more challenging, because at the foundation of this was a certain disavowal of the foundations of the university. In other words, a refusal to accept that this was simply a university that upheld the best traditions of the Enlightenment in whichever guise, but that also this was the underbelly of a form of reason that had become synonymous with the exercise of power under apartheid. And so the constellation of fellows, the various projects, were all drawn into this conversation in one form or the other about what it might mean to think one's way out of the predicament of apartheid. The post-apartheid was what we shared but not in common. And that's another important formulation. In fact, it's something that I was saying to John Mowat when we were students in Minnesota and encountered text, the genealogy of an anti-disciplinary object. There was this moment in that very important book for many of us, where text was that which was shared but not in common across the fields of disciplinary reason. And so we very much along the same contours tried to ask that question of the post-apartheid, about what it might mean to share in the impulse, in the desire for the post-apartheid, albeit, you know, from positions and orientations that were vastly different. So I want to say that this project is not simply a project of practice in that kind of reductive sense in which practice or art practice, that it is tied very much into rearticulating the formations of the humanities in the university, but also asking about whether we might rethink the question of the university, not just in South Africa, but the university more broadly. So this is a fairly ambitious project, maybe a little too ambitious. Some of us have fallen on the sword of this delusional kind of sensibility. But the idea was to think about whether you could constitute a process of thinking through in relation to what various aesthetic kind of projects were aiming at. And our first encounter was the encounter with Ukwanda Puppetry and Design Collective. It so happened that I was on the board of the Handspring Puppet Company Trust, the Education Trust. Jane Taylor, our former colleague, who many of you know, some of you might not know, was a renowned literary scholar in South Africa. She passed away a few years ago, but had gone on to very substantially engage object theatre. And so Ubu and the Truth Commission, for which he is most known, and there are many other reasons to know Jane Taylor and her name, but Ubu and the Truth Commission was one of those powerful iterations of thinking through this complexity that had taken hold in this fairly legalized commission of inquiry into apartheid atrocity and violence. And so with Jane, we decided that one of the things we might want to institute at the heart of a humanities inquiry is the kinetic object, the object that moves. Alongside that, we arrived at a second proposition, which was the idea of the moving image. And so we drew in a conversation around documentary film, brought in Francois Festet to run a course, to think about how we might learn all the elements of documentary film, but to think about documentary film beyond impact and document, to think about it as a certain poetics of reading the present and the past in South Africa. And then thirdly, the third element of this, and only because I was hanging out at Tagore's with Riza Kota and others to think a question of sound. At that point, we were thinking about strings, not so Riza, and to think about whether we could found an inquiry around sound as a site of reading the post-apartheid, the city, questions of movement between rural and urban and so on. Now, this configuration of movement is central to the work that we want to undertake here, partly because we have been locked in the geographies of apartheid. And when you're at UWC on the main campus, as beautiful as that university is, you understand what apartheid's geographies look like. This is a garrison city, and increasingly hardened boundaries of prohibiting movement across the cityscape, which has become a site of enormous anxiety, but has produced forms of race and racism that is now looking like more efficient versions of apartheid than we had before. And so the question of figuring out movement as a counterintuitive move to stasis, and we got that word from Nicole Leroux, a wonderful book called The Divided City, scholar of ancient Athens, and in which she argues that stasis is the condition of civil war. It's the name for civil war, in fact, amongst the Greeks. But she also has something else entailed in that elaboration, and that's the notion of willful forgetting. So that civil war is also constituted around a willful forgetting. So what movement did for us in this space was allowed us to think about the objects that we would want to introduce into an inquiry in the humanities and a university like UWC, but also to think about what movement in the city might look like if you did not think about the ways in which people struggle around housing and so on and so forth. What other ways are we to think about movement? And so the big question here was, how do we build a relation between rural, peri-urban, and urban? But to think also carefully about how anecdote, for example, might circulate through the city and reorganize our sense of the spatialities of race and the racial past. So if you think about and you know, this came from in a wonderfully serendipitous moment. I was on and now I am going to name drop because John Mowat is here. I was on a bus trip with Abdullah Ibrahim. Well, just a few of us on off to the Northern Cape, you know, and he was telling me, well, we spoke about Bruce Lee for much of the trip, but he then said to me that people on the Cape Flats never went to see a double feature. They always went to see a double future. And there's something about that double future that can be both ominous, but also increasingly and evidently productive to think with. And so the cinema was a very important institution in these spaces of Cape Town. As a port city, it was very, very crucial for the ways in which socialities were organized. There's a wonderful essay called "She Preferred to Live in a Cave with Harry the Snake Catcher" by Bill Nasson, and it's about cinema watching. We Read It in our reading group, the fellows of the CHR. So movement was a very important trope through which to think the possibilities of a humanities at an institutional site of a historically black university that was refused an arts education. So UWC was only allowed music teaching for training teachers, school teachers, and at best you could become the organist in the church. Beyond that, there was no possible way for that university to host an aesthetic inquiry. There was something about that refusal and denial that plagued us in the first few years. Why was it? I mean, there was medicine and engineering that were disallowed. That was understandable. But why the arts? And every form of art, no performing arts, no fine art, none of that was allowed at the institution. In fact, for a long period, trees weren't allowed to be planted on the campus because they did not want students to hang around after classes in case they came up with some brilliant idea of overthrowing the state, which they were prone to do. So the question here was, what was at stake in the aesthetic? We had a vice-chancellor in 1987, Jakes Gerwel, who declared the institution an intellectual home for the democratic left. And, you know, the university is largely known for that, and its militancy is marked by that statement. But beneath it, Jakes had a very, very carefully articulated notion of epistemological access, of what it might mean to take first-generation students into your confidence as an institution and guide them through a thinking process that would allow them to make sense of apartheid, its inheritance, and, as we were saying, thinking your way out of that predicament. And what we tried to do is to resurrect that sensibility through the center. So the inquiry then, if we fast forward, has ended. I mean, there are many, many variations and iterations of responses to this question of a post-apartheid desire. Some of it featured in a collection of essays called Desiring the Post-Apartheid. Maurits van Bever-Donker's book, which has just come out now. Ross Truscott, who is now at Leeds, his work. There are a number of people who have written around this question, into this question, in response to this question, but also sometimes overturned the question in various productive ways, sometimes annoyingly so. But that is par for the course. In my own kind of narrative of how we might think about this is around the way in which we had completely misapprehended the problem of apartheid. That something was amiss in our reading of the problem of apartheid. So that when 94 happens, the juridical apparatus kicks in. You have all the mechanisms of law put in place, the instruments that came out of the Second World War, human rights, all of these discourses in place to deal with the aftermath of apartheid. And yet, as we should have imagined then, this was going to prove inadequate because apartheid was a far more deceptive plot than we imagined, and its psychic consequences were far more troubling than we would have imagined. The warning signs were there. The Black consciousness movement had already told us that this phenomenon that we're going to encounter is going to be more elusive than we imagined it to be. And so to think through that difficulty, we disarticulated the problem of apartheid, to take seriously the separation at work in its name, apartness. And with Derrida's racism's last word, began to think about in which ways might we allow for different or variations of apartheid to operate under the name of that sign, apartheid. And we came up with this argument that apartheid was figured around two forms. Grand apartheid, which was a very formidable juridical form of apartheid that oversaw the Group Areas Act, the forced removals of many, many millions of people in Cape Town, all along this mountainside onto the Cape Flats, but nationally, the destruction of large parts of urban centers, Sophia Town, Cato Manor in Durban, and so on and so forth. So there was a juridical apparatus, a juridical form of apartheid called Grand Apartheid. But beneath it was this other form of apartheid called petty apartheid. And the question then became how to make sense of petty apartheid, because despite its deceptive name, it appeared much more intractable as a problem when we looked at it from the other side, as he would put it, of the grave. There was something about petty apartheid that was not as banal and inconsequential as its name would profess. There was something far more intractable in that idea. And so the mapping out of that problem then became a way of telling apartheid as a different kind of problem, to narrate it differently, if you like. It is at that point that this moment of the slave, the figure of the slave, appeared as a worthy inquiry to pursue. So hence our visit to the slave lodge in opening the question of techniques and time. I was reading Norbert Wiener's Human Use of Human Beings. It's a pithy statement about how the slave returns in the kind of configuration of cybernetic automated machines. And there was something about that correlation that, was intriguing to kind of begin a process of re-narrating apartheid. So very quickly, where we were and where many of you are staying on the Lispik River is the site of several important constitutive events that define the onset of a South African modernity. If Aidan Erasmus was here, he'd tell you that's where D'Almeida was defeated in 1510 by the Khoisan, that space that is now occupied by Amazon. And it's very consequential that Amazon should end on this space, because that's also the space where the first observatory was erected by John Herschel. And that's where Darwin visits on his expedition on his way back to London on the Beagle. And that conversation is now legendarily part of an opera that was done by Ross Morris and Yvette Christianse. It was staged in New York recently, about what happened in the house at Feldhausen in Claremont when when Herschel hosted Darwin. Very scant record about what had appeared in that debate. It was a debate, there was a controversy. But this was the moment where physical sciences, the revolution in physical sciences, was transferred into evolutionary biology. And there's an important sequence here, because if evolutionary biology was not observable, what it could do was draw on the revolution in physics to state its methodology, if you like, its hypothesis, process of hypothesis formation. Now that came out of what we call the Cambridge Philosophical Breakfast Club. In the 1830s, this was a group of people who gathered in Cambridge and revolutionized not only science, but the university. In fact, what they put in place was a form of reasoning that took Baconian hypothesis formation and rearranged the terms of it to suit the conditions of empire. Basically, William Whewell and Herschel were involved in a debate about whether a hypothesis at its origin should have a truth claim. In other words, what they call the vera causa, whether it should have something truthful in its onset as a hypothesis. What Whewell had done was to postpone that until you collected sufficiently so that you could put together different classes of facts to see whether they could produce a theory. This is the revolution in inductive science. And it made way for collecting an empire. One of the first expeditions in 1835 was to measure tides. And so Herschel would go down to the harbor every day and measure the tides. There's a huge archive of the measurement of tides that shifted maritime technology in that period. So this revolution in physics, we want to argue, was a foundational moment in not only the reconfiguration of a politics of race after slavery, but also altered the conditions of knowledge very, very substantially. I mean, if we were to take Foucault's, birth of the modern in order of things, we might say that rather than, Las Meninas, it was the artwork that figured the extraction and the reinsertion, the restitching of the slave back into the canvas of the story of modernity. The slave as a kind of labor, a concept of labor, but also a materiality, a corporeality that was going to define the way labor got organized racially in these parts of the world. So, all these discourses on thermodynamics, more importantly, psychophysics, which is why we became so interested in your work, and then cybernetics in the around 1948. It shares a birth date with apartheid, by the way. All of these iterations absorbed the human into a relationship with technology that reproduced conditions of labor, but also reinstituted and modernized the concept of race in both the US and South Africa. And so there's something about your book, Erica, when we work through this text with our fellows, there's something really resonant about what was happening in the field of psychophysics and what was happening in these parts of the world as new forms of labor came to be constituted along master-servant racial lines. And so what we tried to do here is to think very carefully about where does the sequence on psychophysics take you? And here in South Africa, it ended in the education of Hendrik Verwoerd, the so-called architect of apartheid. I've referred to him as a lab technician. I have nothing against lab technicians, but it was a lesser discipline. But that became the organizing principle of both the poor white and the native. So there's a way in which culture and techniques allows us to stage another reading, not only of apartheid, but a reassemblage, a reconfiguration of race that will allow us to think about apartheid as a far-reaching global dynamic that requires a different kind of thinking about how we might want to work out what the post-apartheid desire, what an adequate, appropriate, a desirable post-apartheid desire might look like. And so I wanted to sketch that out because this workshop is drawn out of the sequences in our exploration of that question. And there are many other varieties of how we get to this point. But we are convinced now that there is no way we're going to get through this problem of race without thinking a relationship to technology. So more than it simply being available as instrument in the determination of one sort or the other, we're thinking that technology here needs to be put under the spotlight so that we can understand another set of questions much more explicitly and develop a critique and a theory of it in a much more purposeful way. So let me talk about the fun stuff. That's I wanted to say that, this building is not simply the way we describe it to administrators. We don't always tell them the truth. Not Robert, we tell the truth, but there's some administrators we don't always do. We say, no, we're doing puppets here. And it's outreach, and it's, But actually what we're doing is trying to reimagine the university. So before they know it, they'll be entering a university that would be unrecognizable to them because we would have changed the terms on which this university would function. The Ukwanda Puppetry and Arts Collective, then, the work of the hand is very crucial. We're thinking here about how Carl Jaspers had thought about the figure of the apprentice in relation to the Socratic and scholastic forms of the university. Those have become dominant versions of the university. But the apprenticeship system was always part of the historically black university. So whether you think about Du Bois or Booker T. Washington and that debate, which then entered South Africa through the industrial schools in Natal, and Du Bois's work with Charlotte Maxeke, all of those are figured around what to do with the hand, with apprenticeship. And it's not a reductive question at all. It's in fact a very generative question. So here, rather than technology, techniques allows us to think about what the hand might be doing in relation to thought. And one of the beautiful dissertations that came out of this program is Emma Minkley's The Head and the Hand, which works through the Handspring Puppet Company's archive to re-articulate that relationship between the head and the hand. So Ukwanda is the first thing you encounter as you enter this building. This project has grown into something very, very substantial. They're part of the HERDS project now. Some of you have heard me speak about it. But Sipokazi is here, and I wonder if you want to just say a few words about the work you're doing.
My name is Sipokazi Mbofu. I'm from Uganda, as Premesh said. There's a lot happening here. So as you saw the heads on the screen when we're coming in, we started the work in 2024, January 2024, yes. And then this year, March, we started the work of the heads. Maybe some of you, but I believe Premesh told you, the project was about the climate crisis, which is we are all facing globally. So these animals were migrating from Africa, which is Kinshasa, to Arctic Circle. It was not an easy journey because we are so used of working with the cane and the wood and the polystyrene foam. But then for the heads, the artistic director Neza Muzwabi said, I need completely cardboard from you guys. I don't want puppets that are close to Ukwana style. And again, you need to know that this is all about like, I need material that is eco-friendly. And then we started like, oh, we can do this. We're so excited. As you see the body behind the Premesh.
This one.
Here, this one. So we started with this one. And then it took us 2 months, which is for us, we normally, 3 of us, myself, Sipo and Luya, we can kind of like finish the puppet in a space of a month. But then this one was slowing the process. And then myself and Craig, we went to UK to launch the project. And then when we get there, again, so many challenges. And then we came back to Cape Town. And then we said, how about we have the structure of the wood, which is plywood. The plywood is there. And then Niza said, yeah, it's okay. And then Niza sometimes was stubborn. And then he said, oh, okay, as long as it's going to work for you guys, I trust you. And then we started by cutting the plywood using the jigsaw. Yes. As you see there, that's not the laser cut. We do have pieces out of laser cut. And then we started to build the structure. Yeah, that's the structure of, which animal? I forget. It's okay.
That's the kudu.
No, it's not a kudu. It's not a kudu. And then we did that, and then it worked. And then that's when like we started to work using the plywood as a structure, and then the cardboard as the skin. So it worked. But then again, as Uganda, we normally design. We have our own design. We build the puppets. So for this project, because we had partners in Nigeria, Dakar, and in University of Atlanta in UK, and Manchester, and Aarhus in Denmark. So what we did, we designed, checked the joints and everything. Like everything needs to work here on the workshop in the fabrication. And then after that, we had 2 girls that were working with us. Now we have like almost 3 phases of the whole building. And then you will design and then build. As you see the baboon behind you. So it was like that. You will do that, build, and then have the templates, and then we scan that. After the scanning, we'll give it to the girls that were working with us in this project, so they will do digital design. So it can be easy for the partners all over the world that were working with us. And then we also produced the how-to document, which is, it was the very first time for us, and then it was stressing again, doing the video calls, and then Zoom every day, of explaining that this is how you do it. And then they will say, oh, but then this joint is not working. And then we said, please guys, double check the how to document. And then so it was back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But then at the end, we achieved what we wanted to achieve. But then again, when we get to some places, the puppets, because we were saying like when they were sending us pictures like, oh, it's perfect, it's beautiful. And then we forgot to say to some of them, can you please test it? Yeah. Like so we can see the video. Some of them were sending us the videos were working. But then when we get to those places, day one, we check the puppets because day two we're supposed to teach, which is even the teaching was very limited for puppetry. So we'll teach the locals in a space of 3 days. So when we get there, puppets are not functioning. And then now we need to fix, especially the joint. If your joints are not working, that's the sculpture, not a puppet. So we had to, I'm sorry to say that, that's the reality. So we had to quickly spend the time in the workshop. So in the journey, we're calling the workshop the hospital. So we'll go to hospital, which is, we call it the hospital because every day after the work, after the performances, so many puppets will go to hospital. So we fix them and then they'll be ready for the next day. So yeah, it was successful, but then there was so many challenges, which is we managed to work till the end. Oh, by the way, all the puppets that we built in this workshop, because we packed 14 prototypes with us to Kinshasa, because Kinshasa couldn't build puppets because of the problems that were happening there. So we packed the puppets with us, went to Kinshasa, and then the puppets, we packed them again, Nigeria, Dakar. Those puppets lasted till Arctic Circle, and then they are still in the
Then London.
storage in Netherlands.
Oh, Netherlands.
So, which is, we did it, even our partners, they did it, but then again, this is South Africa. Some places, they don't have like good material that we have in South Africa. So you will get to Morocco, for instance, they have their own webbing tape,
Beautiful.
which
Yeah.
is not a good quality. You go to some places, when we get there, you did send the instruction, and then they will use some glues that you are not familiar with, but then you say, oh, okay, we can fix it. And yeah. And then now the Qatar approached us recently to build some animals, but then they said this is the first phase. We don't know the second phase is going to be what. But then what is so nice about this title here, this is a sculpture, so we are not worrying about the joints. So it's not, no one is going to control it, it's just a sculpture. And then this one, it's for the children who are 6 to 12 years. And then they'll be working with us. So we are going to build this with them. So in January, we're going to Qatar to work with the children. But then for this one, again, maybe they're from 14 to 18, they'll be building these. Again, it's going to be the same style that we did for the heads, which is how to document. And then for this one, again, the challenge is that we'll have to go to Qatar with the flat pieces, and then so that like when we get there we have everything, and then they will just put this together. It's like a puzzle, but then not a puzzle as puzzle, because people were failing like to do it same as us. So we'll be there working with them doing these. They need 6 of these for the museum in Qatar, but then for the kids they need 50 of these. And then the kids will take this at home. But then what is nice about this, the parents will be there working with us and the kids. And then for this one, I think they don't need their parents. We can just teach them. And again, the kids will go on a parade with these because, again, they are saving the turtles. Is it Hawksbeak turtle? I think, yes. So they are saving them. So.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So just one last point. So we're going to go up to the gallery. There's an exhibition that accompanied this workshop that Kim and Karin Stadium opened, and it is also formed around various archival interventions and practices and so on. But just the last point on this project that I think is important to note: the question that John opened with on subject and agent, or subjection and agency, are questions that have been uppermost in our minds. And the way we formulated it is, how does the subject become an agent? And when you try and answer that question, the endpoints are not as obvious as you think they are. They don't necessarily line up in the way that you expect them to. And in some ways, we've struggled with that question over a long period of time because, as we all know, interpolation is a lot more complex than we imagine. But we've put in the center of the work now this question of aesthetic education, which alongside Spivak's intervention we understand as an uncoercive rearrangement of desire. A sensory training, partly because in petty apartheid, it was the sensory order that put people into various geographical locations with very little room to move. And so the sporadic violence you see, 76 you mentioned today, as well, 80, 85, these were because people were locked in these geographies of apartheid. You had technological resources that led to an increase in speed in all sorts of ways. In the 85 moment, it was the cinema. So the moving image, you have this exponential increase of the image of the world, but a locking of the subject in the geographies of apartheid that produces a completely, volatile situation. So it was interesting that when you look at what became the Trojan Horse Massacre in 1985, that I've obsessed with over so many years, that for me is the coagulation of an intensifying speed of the world picture and a trapping of young people without any sense of mobility. That's a script that is being repeated here in the post-apartheid, which we're beginning to warn people that that's a volatile and dangerous proposition to inhabit now. So petty apartheid then has become a site for us to think about what psychophysics has done on the other side of its kind of speculation, that it's produced untenable forms of violence that now need to be dealt with through a particular kind of sensory education and training.